Chapter 3, The Genesis of Marx's Class Theory of Law and State. Abandoning the rational state. Marx's early works gave a radical edge to classical jurisprudence, but they did not radically break from classical jurisprudence's principle. Marx rejected Hegel's conclusion about the form and content of the rational state, but retained this category as the basis of his theory, offering a critique of classical jurisprudence from the perspective of classical jurisprudence, but not yet transcending this perspective. The new direction taken by Marx was to jettison a critique of existing authority relations based on how much or how little they correspond to the idea of a, quote, rational state, and instead to see the actual state as it was, as the historical and transitory product of definite social relations of production. Looking back in his preface to the Critique of Political Economy, published in 1858, Marx summarized the new position he and Engels had together constructed. Quote, "I was led by my studies to the conclusion that legal relations as well as forms of state could be neither understood by themselves nor explained by the so-called general progress of the human mind, but that they are rooted in the material conditions of life which are summed up by Hegel after the fashion of the English and French writers of the 18th century under the name civil society, and that the anatomy of civil society is to be sought in political economy. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure in which legal and political superstructures arise." End quote. It is the logic behind this conception which needs to be fleshed out. The idea of the, quote, rational state, which Marx inherited from Hegel, presupposed that there exists, as a timeless ideal, a form of state which genuinely represents the will of the people. When Marx discovered that not only the actual state, but also Hegel's ideal state fell short of the rational state, his first reaction was not to abandon the concept of the rational state, but rather to search deeper for the rational state's embodiment. The important thing, he said, is to grasp freedom, quote, in its essential character and not in its external relations, end quote. Eventually, however, he discovered that the state is constituted by its corruptions, and that the essence of the state is not something apart from the state's external relations, but rather is the state's external relations. The apt image which Hal Draper painted of Marx's development is that of the peeling away the layers of an onion in order to find its heart, only to discover that there is no heart, that the onion consists only of its layers. The task, as Marx put it, was no longer to find the essence of the state apart from social relations, but in social relations. From the beginning, Marx was critical of the subordination of the state to private property. In his early works, he regarded this as a corruption of the state's essence. In his later work, he regarded it as the essence of the state's corruption. The first partial expression of this new perspective was to be found in a brief note attached to Marx's critique of private property in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, where human existence was equated with abolition of the state and law along with private property. Quote, "Religion, family, state, law, morality, science, art, etc. are only particular ways of production and fall under its general law. The positive abolition of private property as the appropriation of a human way of life is therefore the positive abolition of all estrangement. Hence the reversion of man from religion, family, state, etc. to his human, that is, social existence." End quote. This statement equated the realization of humanity not with the establishment of a rational state, but with the abolition of the state in toto. The, quote, cause of social ills, end quote, as Marx put it in his article on the Silesian Weavers' Uprising of 1844, lies, quote, in the principle of the state, end quote, and not in its corruption. The question, however, was what was the source of the principle of the state? German ideology, first steps in a new direction. In his earlier work, Marx contrasted the freedom and universality of the state with the slavery and egoism of civil society, even when he sought to derive the state from civil society. Later, Marx identified the character of the state with that of civil society. The German ideology of 1846, written in conjunction with Engels, provides a transitional and often inadequate version of this approach. It starts with a restatement of the, quote, old theory that the state emerges out of the, quote, contradiction between particular and common interest, end quote, but gives it a new twist. This was to analyze the contradiction between particular and common interest not as one between civil society and the state, but as one which enters into both civil society and the state. Marx and Engels now saw the state only as, quote, an illusory community, end quote, and in fact, a, quote, alien form, divorced from real individual and collective interests, end quote, as something, quote, independent, end quote, of the real will of the people. The alienated character of Hegel's state no longer appeared. The alienated character of Hegel's state no longer appeared as a deviation from the essence of the state, but rather as the state's essence. Their reasoning was that because individuals seek only their particular interest, their common interest, quote, is asserted as an interest alien to them and independent of them, end quote. The, quote, political spirit, end quote, was not so much emancipated as alienated by its formal separation from civil society. Capital and the state no longer appeared as contrasting, but like principles. Each represented in its own way a, quote, social power which arises through the cooperation of different individuals, end quote, and which appears to these individuals, quote, not as their own united power, but as an alien force existing outside them, of the original and goal of which they are ignorant, end quote. Not only are capital and the state analogous in this sense, but once established, the state becomes an instrument of capital. Quote, the state is nothing more than the form of organization which the bourgeois are compelled to adopt for the mutual guarantee of their property and interest. The state is the form in which the individuals of a ruling class assert their common interests, end quote. While the form of the state arises independently of the will of the bourgeoisie, it soon becomes subjected to their socially determined will, since the state, quote, purchased gradually by the owners of property by means of taxation, has fallen entirely into their hands through the national debt, and its existence has become wholly dependent on the commercial credit which owners of property, the bourgeois, extend to it, as reflected in the rise and fall of government securities on the stock exchange, end quote. The material conditions of life of individuals, quote, their mode of production and form of intercourse, end quote, which by no means depends on the, quote, will either of the rulers or the ruled, gives rise to the alien form of law in the state and compel the individuals who rule, quote, to give their will, which is determined by these definite conditions, a universal expression as the will of the state, as law, end quote. However, the content of law is, quote, always determined by the relations of the ruling class, as the civil and criminal law demonstrates in the clearest possible way, end quote. The importance of these statements from the German ideology is that they offer a materialist explanation of both the form and the content of law and the state, polemicizing against those who believe that either their form or their content is determined solely by the will or needs of men and women. On the other hand, these passages where Marx and Engels first attempt to give a new direction to their critique of law and the state away from Hegel, and it is unfortunate that their sometimes incomplete and erroneous formulations, which they themselves later rejected, have become ossified as shorthand statements of their, quote, mature theory. Marx and Engels' first problem concerned their derivation of the forms of law and the state. Marx and Engels saw the forms of law and the state as, quote, alien forms of authority, estranged from individuals, but Marx and Engels attributed this not to private property, but rather to the very fact of a division of labor. Quote, the division of labor implies the contradiction between interest of the separate individual and the common interest of all individuals. Out of this very contradiction between the particular and common interest, the common interest assumes an independent form as the state, end quote. Marx and Engels however, had no answer as to why the division of labor as such should give rise to the alien form of the state. For example, their assertion that, quote, as soon as the division of labor comes into being, each man has an exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape, end quote, is clearly wrong. Marx and Engels projected characteristics belonging to the contemporary division of labor onto the division of labor in general. It depends on how the division of labor is organized as to whether, for example, individuals are forced into particular tasks or decide democratically among themselves on the allocation of labor, whether the allocation of labor takes place according to a conscious plan or according to market forces, whether individuals are attached rigidly to exclusive tasks or fluidly to multiple tasks, whether there is a rigid separation between mental and manual activity or a fusion of the two spheres, whether individuals are locked in one area of production or may move on to other areas of production, whether the relations of individuals with one another are personal and cooperative or mediated by the exchange of commodities and competitive. Only when the division of labor takes the form of the privatization of property do individuals appear as isolated and self-interested atoms. Believing that social relations can be entered into at will, their relationships with each other based on mutual antagonism and their common interest taking the form of an alien power, since they are incapable themselves of constituting a common interest. The division of labor per se gives rise to the need for some social organ or organs to fulfill those public functions required if the various branches of the division of labor are to be integrated with one another. Functions of internal policing, coordination, mutual defense, etc. But it does not give rise necessarily to the alien form of the state as the means of performing these functions. Why the state should have emerged as the means of fulfilling communal tasks is a question which Marx and Engels did not at this stage satisfactorily resolve. Since all societies, except perhaps the most primitive, are predicated on some division of labor, it would follow from this theory that the state and the law are eternal necessities. We are back again at a new version of natural law theory. Marx and Engels escape this conclusion only by envisaging a utopia in which the division of labor is overcome in its entirety. This was the gist behind their famous depiction of communist society as one in which, quote, society makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner, end quote. In communist society, the division of labor will be more mobile in order to allow for the many-sided In communist society, the division of labor will be more mobile in order to allow for the many-sided development of the individual, and the particular division between mental and manual labor will be abolished, but the division of labor as such will necessarily remain. The implication of this theory with regard to the state was that the state, however alien a form it was, appeared omnipresent as long as there was a division of labor. What changed from one society to the next was only the nature of the class which lays hold of the state, but not the alien character of the state itself. Thus Marx and Engels had not yet overcome a tendency to naturalize law in the state, nor yet had they fully established their class theory of law in the state. The second difficulty facing Marx and Engels concerned the derivation of the content of law in the state. The content of law in the state was determined, they argued, by the common economic interests of the ruling class. With the development of capital, so their argument ran, the apparent independence of the state from society became purely formal. Real independence of the state, quote, is only found nowadays in those countries where the estates have not yet completely developed into classes, where the estates done away with in more advanced countries still play a part, and there exists a mixture, where consequently no section of the population can achieve dominance over the others, end quote. In other words, the separation of the political state from civil society idealized by Hegel turns out not to be the norm of bourgeois society, but rather the peculiarity of Germany, where absolutism still ruled politically in the face of the rising economic power of the bourgeoisie. In fully developed bourgeois society, capital rules politically as well as economically. The view of the, quote, modern French, English, and American writers that the state exists only for the sake of private property, end quote, was a truer representation than Hegel's of the developed bourgeois state. In other words, the formal independence of the state from society seemed to Marx only to have substance where, as in Germany, there is a balance of class forces and an absolutist state can set itself above those class forces. In other situations, the formal independence of the state appeared to Marx as a mere mirage beyond which lay class power, a reductionist view of the state which he was not to sustain. Marx and Engels carried over from their own respective earlier works their conception of civil society as slavery and their moral critiques of egoism only, quote, in imagination, end quote. Engels and Marx wrote in the German ideology, quote, do individuals seem freer under the dominance of the bourgeoisie than before? In reality, of course, they are to a greater extent governed by material forces, end quote. They argued correctly that freedom of property is formal, observing that, quote, the jus utendi et abutendi, the right to use and abuse, asserts the illusion that private property is based solely on the private will, the arbitrary disposal of the thing. In practice, the abutendi has very definite economic limitations for the owner of private property. If the owner of private property does not wish to see his property and hence his just abutendi pass into other hands, end quote. But it is precisely this formal character that marks off the epoch of commodity production from other epochs. It is a, quote, juridical illusion, end quote, that social relations are based solely on will, but it is not an illusion that in a society based on private property, social relations are mediated by acts of individual will. Marx and Engels' tendency to treat the formal freedom and equality present in civil society as illusions was now reflected in their theory of the state. Its formal character of communality was now also declared to be an illusion, behind which lay the unlimited power of private property. Their other comment of the jus utendi et abutendi, that it, quote, asserts the fact that private property has become entirely independent of the community, end quote, was not true. Rather, the idea that private property had become entirely independent of the community was also a juridic illusion. In reality, the, quote, community necessarily restricts the independence of private property as Hegel appreciated through the state. Historically, it was untrue that the development of the state apparatus as an independent force, separate from private property, was an expression of the peculiar character of German absolutism. Rather, it became a general characteristic of all developed bourgeois societies, which required explanation rather than denial. The issue was not only to disclose that the form of the state has the power of private property as its content, but also to explain why the power of private property did, as a matter of historical fact, take the independent form of the state. These democratic forms, which Marx had previously identified with freedom and universality, the rule of law, representation, general suffrage, were now theorized as mere forms or illusions. There was a residue of the young Engels' anarchistic dismissal of democracy as, quote, nothing but hypocrisy, end quote, of political liberty as, quote, sham liberty, the worst possible slavery, the appearance of liberty, and therefore the reality of servitude, end quote, and Engels' conclusion that, quote, we must have either a regular slavery, that is, an undisguised despotism, or the real liberty and real equality, that is, communism, end quote. It was only later that Marx and Engels, spurred on by their critiques of political economy, were able to theorize the contradictory rather than the illusory character of the freedom, equality, and independence manifested in the liberal state. Directly linked to this problem was the static conception both of class and of the state which Marx and Engels offered. Drawing on Engels' critique in The Condition of the Working Class in England, that the state is a class weapon, with which, quote, the bourgeoisie defends its interests with all the power at its disposal, end quote. That the bourgeoisie is, quote, the chief, in fact the only power in Parliament, end quote. That the cabinet minister is, quote, the obedient servant of the bourgeoisie, etc., end quote, etc. They presented the common interest of the bourgeoisie as the content of law and the state. But the bourgeoisie does not exist in a vacuum, but rather in a definite relation to other classes of civil society: workers, the old gentry, the petty bourgeoisie, the lumpenproletariat. The struggle between capital and labor is not static, but depends on the level of development, organization, and consciousness of each, and on the alliances which each is able to forge with other classes. Capital is not just a, quote, thing, end quote, but rather the expression of a relation to labor, a relation that is not constant, but shifts in accordance with the ebbs and flows of class struggle. The particular form taken by the state is similarly not static. From one period to the next, it may become more or less alienated from the people, more or less subject to democratic control, more or less bureaucratic, more or less bound by rules of law, more or less permissive of working class organization, etc. While the state in general is an alienated form of authority, the extent and form of this alienation are not fixed. Thus, while it is true to say that the state serves the ruling class, it is nevertheless entirely insufficient. For the form taken by the state is determined not by the ruling class alone, but by the relations between the ruling class and other classes. It is the capital-labor relations which determine the form of the state, and not capital alone. While parliamentary democracy and bureaucratic dictatorship are both forms of bourgeois domination, they are none the less different forms and reflect different relations between capital and labor. The beginnings of such a view were already present in the German ideology in Marx and Engels' comment that, quote, all struggles with the state, quote, all struggles within the state, the struggle between democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, the struggle for the franchise, etc., are merely the illusory forms in which the real struggles of different classes are fought out among one another, end quote. Apart from the notion that the political form of class struggles is, quote, illusory, end quote, while class struggles themselves are, quote, real, end quote, as if classes exist independently of their political forms, we see in this passage a more dynamic connection between forms of state and class relations than was allowed to appear in the main body of the theory of the state. Forms of state, fascism, democracy, liberalism, apartheid, bureaucratic dictatorship, etc., and their content, whether its laws recognize a right to strike, a right to organize, a right to privacy, a right to jury trials, a right to freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, a right to demonstrate, a right to collective self-defense, etc., are determined not by the will of the rulers alone, but by the real relations between and within the classes which comprise bourgeois society.